Hello, YouTube book fans. I've got an interesting one for you today. I just finished reading Beowulf, a translation by Seamus Healy. It's surprising to me that I haven't gotten to this earlier in my career. I've never actually read it before, but it's the kind of thing that I am always interested in, and so I'm glad I finally read it because it's not only a piece of history, it's not only a piece of great literature and of great poetry, but it's got a really interesting kind of literary lineage that I want to get into a little bit, because as regular viewers will know, I am a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings trilogy and all of his writings, and so this book was certainly influential on him and his writing, and I couldn't help marveling at it as I went through it, kind of how many parallels there are and how many things were clearly drawn from this book for Tolkien's own writing. So let's get into it. Okay, a little bit of background for those who don't know. Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon epic written in the Anglo-Saxon language, or Old English as it's often called. It's a little bit misleading, I think, because when people hear the term Old English, they think of Shakespeare or Milton or maybe Chaucer. Chaucer was actually written in Middle English, and Beowulf was written at least 500 years earlier than Chaucer. So it is a very different language. It's extremely foreign to English speakers. It's as foreign as a language like Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic. Icelandic is probably the closest modern language that resembles Old English, because it was isolated on that little island for so long and hasn't really been allowed to change very much over the years. So if you can read Icelandic, you'll probably be at home here. But I cannot read Icelandic. I have a very basic knowledge of some of the Germanic and Scandinavian languages, and I was able to read a little bit of it because the edition I have is dual text. It's got the Old English on one side and the modern English on the other side. It's listed as a verse translation. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. I would not call the translation verse. The meter is very loose and there's no rhyme. It really reads like a prose translation, but it's all laid out very like word for word alongside the Old English, and I found it fascinating to kind of compare them and read them together and try to decipher a little bit of the original language, because it's actually really beautiful. I took a class in college on the history and structure of the English language, and there were some readings from Old English in that class, and it's just a gorgeous language. It sounds really lovely and really lilting. It has just a wonderful quality to it. So I'd like to learn more about it and get more familiar with the language and able to read some of the original text a little more clearly than I can right now, because right now it reads like a foreign language. You really can't get more than a couple words out of it unless you've studied it. Beowulf is an epic poem. It's about 3,000 lines. It tells a very simple story, but it tells it in an elaborate way. It's about this kind of Scandinavian warrior. He comes from Geatland, which is sort of like in northern Norway, I understand, and his name is Beowulf. And he comes down to the land of the Danes, which I assume is Denmark. I'm not sure how closely it parallels with modern Denmark. And they've had a problem with their castle is being assaulted basically by this monster that lives out in the wilderness called Grendel. And Grendel is variously described as a demon or some kind of an animal or some kind of a fiend. He's listed as a member of the race of Cain, because when Cain slew his brother Abel and was cursed by God, he had all these kind of monstrous offspring. I was actually kind of surprised about the biblical references, because there's quite a lot of biblical references here. And I guess I never really thought about it, but the early Anglo-Saxons, I suppose, would have been Christian, so it makes sense that they're here, although they're almost all Old Testament references, kind of a more fire and brimstone way of looking at the Bible. There's not a lot about Jesus in here, but I kind of never put those two together in my head. I never really thought, oh yeah, these were all Christians, these Vikings and these these warriors, but I guess they kind of were. So that was really interesting. I wasn't expecting that. So Grendel is attacking this kingdom. King Hrothgar has his castle, and Grendel is annoyed that the castle makes too much noise and has light and has music coming out of it, and he comes out of the murky fens and marshes and attacks the guards and kills all the men, and he's just like, it's a reign of terror that goes on for a long time. And the king is upset about this, and Beowulf comes with some of his countrymen, and he says, I can do this. I'm the strongest warrior in the land. I have no problem. I'll take care of Grendel. So he does. He fights Grendel. He tears his arm off, and he literally tears his arm off. Grendel heads back into the wilderness to die, and everyone celebrates for a really long time, telling songs, singing songs, telling stories, eating and drinking, being merry, giving each other gifts, and saying how great Beowulf is for having done this. Unfortunately, Grendel has an avenger in his mother, who also comes and tries to wreak havoc on the castle, and Beowulf goes out on a quest to hunt her down and kill her as well, which he does. He finds her in her underwater lair in the bottom of a lake, and he goes down there. He's a very strong swimmer, is one of his qualities, and he finds a magical sword that was inherited from giants who used to roam the earth before the flood. and he kills Beowulf's mother with it. And then the sword, very picturesquely, it melts away. The blade melts, and he's left with only a hilt, which, this is starting to get into our Tolkien references, where you have the Morgul blade or the dagger that melts after you use it. Tolkien was, of course, a professor of philology and a scholar of languages, and he loved this kind of stuff. It's well known that he based a lot of his material on the Nibelungenlied, a Scandinavian epic, which I have not yet read, actually, but also this clearly comes into it. There's a character called Eomer, which is a name from one of the Rohan people in Tolkien, and the Beowulf himself is actually called a Lord of Rings at one point, which I thought was pretty funny. So after Beowulf kills Grendel's mother, he becomes king. He goes back to his homeland and is celebrated, and he reigns for a long time. And then many years later, when he's an old man, a dragon comes. And there's a dragon sitting on a hoard of gold, and he's guarding it, and someone sneaks into the hoard and steals a bejeweled cup and takes it out, and it enrages the dragon, and the dragon comes out and starts burning everything and destroying, laying waste to the landscape, the desolation of Smaug. And it's very reminiscent of the kind of stuff Tolkien was writing about in The Hobbit with Smaug, because Beowulf then says, I'm going to go slay the dragon, and he goes and fights it with a band of little young warriors that are helping him because he's old. And he ultimately is killed by the dragon. The dragon bites him on the neck, and he dies of the poison, but he is able to stab the dragon in the side and kill it at the same time. So he goes down in history as a great hero who rid the countryside not only of Grendel and Grendel's mother, but of this dragon, and he comes out of it looking really good. But the dragon's sitting on a pile of gold, and someone sneaking in and burgling a cup and enraging the dragon, who then comes out and, just spews fire all over the countryside. It's right out of The Hobbit. It's the same thing. And it's kind of hard, it's not really fair to compare the two, I guess, because Beowulf came 1,000 years before The Hobbit. But it's hard for me, having read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings so many times, not to kind of look backwards and compare it to this. But it's clear where Tolkien got a lot of his ideas from. I find the language itself really beautiful. Like I said, I was trying to read along with the Old English to the extent that I could. And, one of the things that's not captured in translation, particularly of poetry, is the sound of the language. And so there's all these, there's a lot of alliteration that goes on. There's a lot of words that sound very similar but have different meanings in modern English. So there's a lot of poetry and internal rhymes. It doesn't rhyme in the way that we think of a poem rhyming today, but there's a lot of little internal rhymes and words that sound similar to each other in the poetry of it, which is pretty cool. I like that a lot. And then just the imagery of it is really striking and poetic, I think. There's all this, misty marshland and fens and heaths where Grendel is stalking around, and that's really spooky monsters coming out of the darkness to kill people in the night. And then when Beowulf goes to fight Grendel's mother in her underground, her subterranean lair underneath the lake, it's very beautifully described and very poetic, and you have all these glistening bright objects underneath the water, and all this kind of murky lizards swarming around, and there's a lot of good imagery there. And then again with the dragon and talking about its shining iridescent scales and the way it breathes fire and all the gold that it hoards. I mean, the poet, whoever composed this, it's anonymously composed because you just don't know. It was too long ago. Whoever composed this had a very vivid imagination, and it's I think a very visual imagination, and it really comes through. So I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's not always easy to read these older texts. They're often quite a slog. I've been trying to get through things like the Canterbury Tales and La Morte d'Arthur and the Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel for years. I'm going to get through all those at some point, but they're not easy to read. This translation was pretty simple, and it's actually not that long. When you read it in more of a prose fashion, you can get through it pretty quickly. But it was much easier than those other texts that I've tried to get through. And it's short enough that you can really digest it and read it. So I recommend it if you're interested at all in old epics or the origins of modern fantasy literature. This is certainly a worthy read. And I know Tolkien himself has a new translation. Well, not new now because Tolkien's been dead a long time, but it was recently published. Translation of Beowulf that came out a couple years ago, and I'm really now interested in getting that, and I want to study the language a little bit more, and I want to study the poem a little bit more, because I really did think it was cool. You can kind of lose something in a less than noble translation. You can kind of lose some of the poetry, and you can lose some of the, you just read it like a prose story. It's pretty simple. Beowulf kills a couple guys and then a dragon, and he becomes king. Hooray! But you miss out when you don't get more of a sense of the original language and the original sound of it and structure of it, because it really does add something to it, and I think that's important to get into. So that's why I always like to get these dual language editions when I can, because even if I don't speak the language, being able to look over and just see kind of how the words are put together and where the rhymes are and where the alliteration is really does help when you're dealing with something that is poetic in nature. So there you go. That's my review of Beowulf. I really enjoyed it. I think it's fascinating as a historical artifact, and it's fascinating as a poem, and it's always enlightening to kind of look back, in the distant history, more than 1,000 years old now. This poem is, and it's like life was so different back then. People thought so differently. People acted so differently, and it's just kind of fascinating to get a glimpse into that world, even as small as this is. It really does. It feels like a lot of the mythology of Old England is in here, things like giants and trolls and dragons and etchins and goblins and all that stuff. It's all listed in here, and you can kind of see that's sort of blended with biblical allusions, and you really kind of get a sense for where England's culture came from, and that's pretty cool. So I recommend it. You guys should read Beowulf. It won't take you very long, and you'll enjoy it. And I'll catch you next time with another review. Thanks so much for watching.